Hello, my name is Agustín Fuentes, and my talk is entitled, Who is the We in Biological Anthropology? Views from Somewhere in Ethical Discourse and Practice. So we is a very important term. We is a gender-neutral collective engagement, the drawing in, the connecting, the putting together. But I think, particularly in the context of ethics, we need to be very aware of how we deploy this term, what we actually mean by it, and more importantly, what are we doing with the term itself? We is powerful, beneficial, but it also has to be used carefully and with caution. So there is no view from nowhere. That is, there is no true full-on objectivity, complete neutrality in context. There's always a view from somewhere. So where are these views from in biological anthropology? When we're thinking about sort of the broader ethical context of our discipline, where are the views from and who gets to provide and promote the views, right? Those things are very important. The context here is going to be specifically about sort of human remains and ancient DNA, sort of thinking through those. But in the broader sense, who gets to establish what the view of we is? So Rick Smith and Deborah Bolnick really beautifully laid out a context for this frame in 2019. Biological anthropology, they say, has been instrumental in producing scientific knowledge about humans and non-humans, but historically, that knowledge has been framed by classist, patriarchal, heterosexist, white supremacist, and settler colonial agendas. These politics were embodied in many of the founding fathers of our field and live on in some of their intellectual descendants, resulting in the exclusion or marginalization of other bodies and voices in our field. Because of this history, we have inherited a flawed, intentionally circumscribed, and incomplete scientific corpus on human and non-human variation, which has ramifications across scientific, social, legal, and political spheres. So as we create as we collectively come together and think with what we do as biological anthropologists, this view from somewhere, this history, this context is extremely important. So let me come to the end to connect with sort of genomics and human remains. But to do that, let us walk through sort of this thinking of how we sort of frame the experiences and the contexts that we bring to working with human remains and genetic material. The key areas are, of course, demography and lived experience. So we as a very diverse group in biological anthropology with different backgrounds, different identities, different nationalities, different linguistic, historical, what have you, frames. So demography and lived experience then has to be part of the consideration of the teams we build, particularly around issues related to genomics and human remains work, to the kind of interaction with stakeholders, with the community collaborators that we engage with. Demography and lived experience is a central part of the we of biological anthropology and has to be front and center. We have to understand those different voices, narratives, experiences are critical, not just to sort of the outcomes of the research, but in fact, the way we constitute the questions, the engagements, and the projects themselves. There is great power, right, unequally distributed within biological anthropology, within the research and the landscapes and the academy writ large. But how we think about power in the context of our collective grouping around these themes of focus, let's say with genomics or human remains projects, who has the power? Who has the financial power? Who is delivering the academic or carrying the credentials of the academy? How does this relate? Who has the power within the communities that we're working with? Who can mediate that power? And how can one respect the different modes or central components of power? So the we here, right, this collective, this coming together has multiple nodes of power that we have to keep in mind as we navigate these kinds of structures. So, and areas of focus, I think, is very important. This is something we collectively as biological anthropologists often overlook, that many of us do different kinds of biological anthropology, different theoretical and methodological skill sets that we bring, right? So this we is actually, in the ideal situation, quite diverse in the sense of theory and method coming together to collaborate, to work together on a particular project. So the different areas of focus that are brought in or should be brought in or need to be brought in for the kinds of work that biological anthropology hopes to do with genomics and with sort of issues, projects related to human remains is very important. So demography, power, areas of focus. So how do these notions, the different ways we constitute we, right? How do these sort of come to play in this sort of ethical and moral context related to anthropological engagement with genomics and with human remains? Well, I think there's some key frames for us to consider. And the first is, of course, race and racism, or racism, because the two cannot be disarticulated. And that is when we're thinking about human biological variation, be it morphological, physiological, genomic, what have you, the frame in which that variation exists for much of the world, and particularly here in the United States, for example, much of the Americas, and well, basically everywhere. But the frame is frequently structured by a history and contemporary context of race and racism. So from an ethical and moral and functional perspective, that is how you do your work, that has to be front and center. So how does the we that we've constituted, our group, our research group, the communities we're collaborating with, what are the blocks, the stumbles, the infrastructures, the histories of race and racism that structure that? Because one cannot talk about genomics or any part of the human in most of the world without acknowledging histories and structures of violence surrounding race and racism that structure the discussions from the very get-go. And if they don't, if this is not something that a project is aware of, it's going to have problems. The second is thinking very much, not in contemporary DNA, but thinking about ancient DNA and how we bring all of these different components together. Currently, and it's really been getting wonderfully diverse, the kinds of teams doing aDNA work and the kinds of collaborative community-based efforts that we're seeing coming out of SING and coming out of a number of different projects that push against the sort of traditional models of sort of central labs focusing their sort of ideology or practice. So we, in an aDNA study, includes not just the researchers, not just the communities, but also the conceptualizations of how the different stakeholder communities envision their communities, past, present, and future, right? And so I think it's very important for us to seriously consider how communities work together, whether the scientific community, research communities, local communities of stakeholders for samples. All of those things are very important, which leads to this sort of third point, and that is samples, be they genomic sequences or actual human osteological remains. Samples are humans, right? They are part of we. They're part of the species, but more important, they're part of communities, they're part of histories, they're part of lives. So everything that I've just mentioned becomes a central component of focus. We have to sort of frame our engagement, our thinking about these topics very much in dialogue with the constant awareness that human remains are humans, right? They are us, and they are part of the communities in particular ways. And those ways, the ways that these sequences, the genomic sequences or remains structure or form part of communities differs from community to community, from place to place. And so being aware of that is an ethically central component. You need to know as a researcher going in and collaborating with folks how these things play out. All of this then is related to PhD training and mentoring. So this notion of biological anthropology engaging with genomics and human remains studies means that in our training and mentoring, we need to think about the constitution of we, of us. How are we doing that? How are we constructing it? What are the specific deployments, the considerations? How do we bring together, right, in this collective sense, groups that are equitable and ethical surrounding these particular kinds of issues? There are many more complexities, but the time is very short. What I would like to say is that we, right, biological anthropology needs to practice and engage our subjects with scholarly rigor. We all agree on that, but also be aware of alterity, be aware of differences, push against some of the normativities, be they heteronormativity or Euronormativity or English language normativity. Push against some of these normativities to understand how to construct even more inclusive we's, which will benefit the specifics of the project. We also need to think about diversity, not just in inter-individual diversity, but diversity of cultural and historical and perceptual realities. The way in which people identify with or about human remains or genomic sequences, those have to be centered in our research design, right? Implementation, and thought of before we think about publishing or data storage or all these kinds of things. And if we do that, I think we achieve this next component, which is care. I think care has to be ethically at the center of what we're doing if we're engaging with humans, right? And that's what many of us are doing. And finally, I'd like to suggest that we, right, biological anthropology, need to practice a kind of intellectual generosity so that all of these things are available and possible. And that means that there might be disagreements in theory and method and a variety of different conflicts between researchers and communities, but we have to be able to navigate those, engage them with care and with a kind of intellectual generosity that allows for a much better outcome. We can't always do everything one wants, and that's a good thing, but we can do most things as collaborative, caring, and generous engagements. So the we, how we constitute it, what we do with it, what theory and method we bring, and how we engage with samples and remains is absolutely central to an appropriate and effective ethical engagement. Thank you very much.